Well, I'm joined now by Michael Oren, who's a former Israeli ambassador to the United States, who joins us now from New York. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador. In your opinion, does this 20-point plan, this US framework, represent a step closer to ending the war in Gaza?
I think it's more than a step. It's potentially a giant leap. It could spell the end of the war in Gaza. There are many moving parts. Things can change. I would say generally that as a work of statecraft, of diplomacy, it's kind of a masterstroke. How President Trump's team, this is Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and others, managed to get all these disparate states on board, states that don't agree with one another on very much, certainly don't agree on Israel-Palestine at all. This is still states on Turkey and Qatar on one side, Saudi Arabia, UAE on the other, Jordan. Get them all together to agree to these 20 points. And then get Israel to agree, get Netanyahu to agree. That has got to go down in the history books as one of the great masterstrokes of diplomacy.
So all of that taken into consideration, I mean, do you think we're likely to get an answer quite promptly out of Hamas to this, given that they must be feeling that, the rest of the world seems to think that it's a pretty good plan?
Well, what the plan does is basically give Hamas a simple choice. Either you surrender or you die. I put it most frankly, that if Hamas rejects the plan, then President Trump will give a green light to Israel and the Israel Defense Forces to continue its ground operation in Gaza City and to eliminate the last pockets of Hamas resistance. So it's not much of a choice for Hamas there. And then it goes to the essence of what this organization is. It is a Islamicist jihadist organization, which, in any other circumstance would prefer martyrdom to surrender. Well over almost 2 years now, at the beginning of the war, I gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal where I suggested that we revisit the 1982 evacuation of Beirut by Yasser Arafat and the PLO, that we could do the same thing with Hamas, offer Hamas the opportunity to get on boats and go somewhere safely, and Israel would commit not to harm them. And at the time, that suggestion was kind of laughed off, even by Israeli policymakers, saying that Hamas would prefer to die rather than get on one of those boats, and explaining why that this is not just about the way Hamas sees young Muslims looking at them today, but the way they'll be looked at 50, 100, 1,000 years from now. It made sense. It made sense. Right now, though, it's still on the table, and that offer is hardwired into the 20 points. Those members of Hamas who do not want to take swear an oath that they will no longer pursue terrorism, and that they accept peaceful coexistence with Israel, have the option of leaving Gaza on that Yasser Arafat-like boat to where is uncertain. But I remain unconvinced that Hamas will avail itself of that offer.
OK, so there are 20 points in that plan, and obviously the goal is to get Hamas to agree to all 20 of them. One of the points alluded to Palestinian statehood, and on that particular point, when asked about it, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, quote, absolutely not, when asked about the prospects of a two-state solution. So does that set the right tone if the Israeli Prime Minister is outright ruling out one of those 20 points before we've even heard back from Hamas?
Well, I'm sure the tone will not be welcomed in many quarters in the Middle East, and not only in the Middle East, certainly in Europe. But here, the devil is not so much in the detail, but the angel's in the detail. The 20 points talk about not creating a Palestinian state. It talks about taking steps toward a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. Now, the pathway term, the word has been used frequently by the Saudis. And I think that this is the way the Saudis, who don't necessarily have public opinion, they're not a democracy, but they do have to assuage popular Arab opinion about the Palestinian issue, say they want a pathway to Palestinian statehood. Now, what does that mean? A pathway could be something with gravel, doesn't necessarily lead to anything. And I think the Saudis would be very, very cautious before creating a Palestinian state that could become a Hamas state, and that would threaten Jordan and threaten much of the Gulf. So they'd like to have this discussion. And I've long been an advocate that Israel should say yes to this, that Israel should engage in a dialogue about a pathway to a Palestinian state. Here it is. It gets hardwired into the 20 points. So Netanyahu says he's going to oppose the state. He's going to oppose the creation of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. But he's not going to oppose that part of the 20 points that says that Israel at some point must enter into a discussion about a credible pathway. And I think that gives him a little bit of wiggle room politically. And so far, the radical right components of his coalition have not bolted that coalition.
I mean, on that note, I mean, how politically risky is all of this for Prime Minister Netanyahu? Because there are some who are speculating and suggesting, some analysts are out there saying that this deal with President Trump could cost Netanyahu his government.
I think Netanyahu is too cunning politically. Yes, there are risks. There are definitely risks. And there is one particular member of the government, Mr. Ben-Gvir, who's riding very high in the polls, who could bolt the coalition and bring down the government. And the big question is whether other opposition heads will come into the government again. Now, Benny Gantz, for example, the head of a large opposition party, says that if these radical right-wing parties leave the coalition, he will come in and support Netanyahu if Netanyahu goes toward agrees to an end-of-war hostage release agreement. So let's see if that happens. This is not the first time we've been in a situation like this in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu bears what I call the Y plantation scar. And if you remember old enough to remember this, the late 90s, his first term as prime minister, President Clinton negotiated an agreement between Israel and the PLO. It was actually the last agreement between Israel and the PLO, between Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, in which Netanyahu had to concede large parts of the city of Hebron, which is a holy Jewish city. And Clinton assured him that if he made this decision and the right-wing members of his coalition left the coalition, that Clinton assured him that left-wing Israeli parties would come into that coalition. So what happened? Netanyahu signed on the agreement. The right-wing parties made the agreement, left the coalition, and the left-wing parties took several steps backward to let Bibi fall. That's what I call the Y plantation scar. And whether this time Netanyahu can be assured that should the radical right-wingers lead this coalition, the centrists will come into it.
One of the other things to emerge from those talks at the White House was an apology for Qatar from the Israeli Prime Minister. And I'm just wondering if you think that's significant and whether it brings Qatar back into the fold in that role of negotiator.
I think this was also a stroke of genius, I must say. Israel has apologized many times for mistakes made of this nature. Netanyahu, this would be the third time, if anybody's counting, that Netanyahu has apologized. He apologized to King Hussein of Jordan back in his first term in the 90s for a failed attempt to assassinate Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. He apologized, and I helped draft that apology. In 2013, he apologized to President Erdogan of Turkey for the Mavi Marmara affair. And so here again, another apology, a very similar apology, by the way. He said that Israel did not intend to attack Qatar. It wanted to attack Hamas, who just happened to be on Qatari territory. And he committed to not do it again. But the masterstroke is that Qatar, in return, promised to enter into a dialogue with Israel about how we can best address our mutual grievances, our mutual outstanding complaints. And I think that's very, very productive.
Okay, I mean, there are so many striking elements to this deal and so many striking developments over the last 24 hours. I mean, one person I want to ask you about is Tony Blair, who is obviously going to be potentially very much involved in overseeing the next chapter of Gaza's governance. I'd like to ask you how he's perceived in Israel and whether you think he's the right man for this job.
Well, first, I was delighted to hear about Tony's involvement. When I was in government, I worked with Tony Blair on a Gaza project. So I know that Gaza has been a source of deep concern for him for many years. It didn't start just with this war even. And very productive. He has a very fine reputation in Israel and remembered fondly. And he has the trust. He has the trust of just about, I think, all sides. Everyone likes him in the Middle East. I don't know if the same can be said of Great Britain, but everyone likes him very much in the Middle East and trusts him. And he has a good working relationship with both Trump and with Netanyahu and with Arab leaders.
So where we go to from here, I mean, obviously Hamas is going to be under a lot of pressure, not just from the United States. We understand President Trump is suggesting a 3 to 4 day deadline for them to respond to this deal. But they're also going to be coming under pressure from other leaders in the Middle East, where I'm speaking to you from now. But on the other side, I mean, it does look like Israel's under a certain amount of pressure, not just domestically, Prime Minister Netanyahu, but internationally. I mean, Western leaders, all of the countries that have recognized a Palestinian state in the last couple of weeks, I mean, they're also going to be applying pressure to Israel. I mean, does it look like, with pressure coming from all these different directions on the two parties that are concerned, mean that perhaps we're going to be inevitably in a situation where there is a result?
Well, I think it's not quite symmetrical, Tom, and that is that, yes, Israel's under immense amount of pressure internationally, but it has the backing of President Trump. And that's the lifeline. And as long as Israel has that backing, and by the way, I think to maintain that backing was one of the reasons that Prime Minister Netanyahu made some significant concessions in this agreement. For example, discussing the possibility of a future Palestinian state, the involvement of the Palestinian Authority in the future governance of Gaza under certain circumstances. Netanyahu had completely ruled it out. He conceded that because he needs to stay on the right side of Donald Trump, and he managed this. He navigated those shoals very, very well, I thought. So Hamas is a completely different situation. I think that even Hamas's primary backers, once upon a time, Turkey and Qatar, have had it. I think one of the background to this agreement is that the leaders of the Middle East, without exception, look at October 7th, 2023 and said, what do we need that for? Hamas brought untold suffering and instability and violence to the Middle East. Who needs it? And it's the time for Hamas now to pack up and leave. And Israel made it clear that it was not going to stop. It wasn't going to stop its pressing its invasion of Gaza City. And leaders of the Middle East don't need that type of instability, as you know. They need quiet, especially around the Israel-Palestine, because what begins with Israel-Palestine doesn't end with Israel-Palestine. Israel-Palestine ends up in the streets of Riyadh and Doha and other places. So they wanted to put an end to it. Now the question is, does Hamas bend to that pressure? Does it find some face-saving mechanism that will enable it to evacuate Gaza, its leaders, and to demilitarize, to hand over its guns? I can't tell you that. I know that within Hamas itself, in their DNA, and I've spent a lot of time studying that DNA, there'll be tremendous opposition to this. There's be a preference to say, okay, we will fight to the bitter end. We'll fight to our martyrs. I don't know. What is very important, though, is that really this agreement represents a sea change. It puts the bulk of the pressure on Hamas, not on Israel, and it provides a very clear pathway toward relieving this conflict. The key to it, it's interesting, there's only one time specified in the entire 20 points, and that is the 72 hours that Hamas has to release all the hostages. And it will probably try to prevaricate. It'll probably say, oh, we like this agreement, but we have questions, or we have corrections. And they'll say, oh, we don't know where all the hostages are. They've already saying it, by the way. Donald Trump has to put his foot down and say, okay, you've got 24 hours or 48 hours to give me a yes or a no. We're not going to drag this out.
Okay, what's your hunch, just lastly, Ambassador? I mean, how do you rate the chances of this deal being translated into some constructive steps forward?
That's probably the hardest question you got to ask me, Tom, because I'm not I'm a historian, and I got enough problems to predicting the past, I always say. My gut feeling is that Hamas won't go for it. I don't care what kind of pressure they're under. And it goes against everything that they believe in and everything they've been educated to believe in. And I don't think there's a face-saving device out there that will enable them to speak to generations of people who come after them and look back at this period of history and ask themselves who won. Hamas needed one thing and one thing only, and that was to come out of the tunnels and stand on the rubble and go like this. That's all they needed. And because Israel to win a war has to actually win the war. Hamas to win the war only has to not lose the war. And that image, and it's not the first time. If you look on your images on Google, you'll see images of Ismail Haniyeh standing on the rubble of 2014, going like this. It's a victory pose. And what the 20 points are asking Hamas is to relinquish the victory pose. And that will be profoundly difficult for them.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the US. Thank you for your time, sir.